Today's scripture passage comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. It's the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Hear this good news. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for a day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon, and then about 3 in the afternoon, and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around, and he asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and then going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do that? And right to do what I want with my money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." So I find this parable to be a very interesting one because it contrasts 2 very different periods of my life between where I am now and the religion that I inherited and was involved in from the time I was a young boy into a young adult. What it's like is that for many people in my previous tradition, they would give up so much and follow all the religious rules. And then they would hear a story of someone who did a deathbed confession, right? It was right before they died. They gave their heart to Jesus, and then everyone says they were saved, and they were incensed the fact that I have given up so much, and I followed all the religious rules, and they get the same reward as I do? Now, that might sound very strange to some of you, but that some of you, I know you've heard that too. And so the response to that is, that's not fair. Now, I know that when I was a young boy, and I perceived and experienced what I thought was a terrible injustice, I would go tell my mom. And when I did not get the response that I wanted from my mother, I would exclaim, "That's not fair." And my mom's response to me was that universal mother response. What is it? You beat me to it. Life is not fair. We might indeed feel cheated if we hold that only those who have earned more credits in their religious life than debits get to go to heaven. In my former tradition, I heard discussions about this. And they were wondering, how is it that someone with a deathbed confessional could still get the same reward as those who had lived their whole life into the faith? And the teacher or the preacher, whomever it was leading the discussion, would use this parable as a proof text to, yep, I know, but we all get the same reward. And it just wasn't fair. Look at me. I've spent my whole life giving up on all the fun stuff in life, and this person did all that fun stuff, and they still get the same reward as me. That it's not fair. But then the discussion would then start to make some changes, right? It would start to evolve into a new type of thinking of what heaven must be like. So then, in order to help to ease the conscience of those and the minds of those who were complaining, it was like, well, those of us who have lived our whole lives for Jesus, and those of us who have abstained from anything that is fun, and those of us who have given our whole lives to just being very righteous and rigid in the rules and obeying all the rules, when we get to heaven, we're going to have the big mansions on the hill. And that guy who had the deathbed confession, well, he'll get a small little cabin in the woods with no electricity or plumbing. That seemed to soothe everybody's mind a little bit. And it seemed a little bit more fair. Here's the thing. The 5 big sins for me when I was growing up were drinking alcohol, dancing, cussing, smoking cigarettes, sex before marriage, and watching R-rated movies. And when those persons and that religious tradition found out that someone got the same reward as they did, they have given up all that stuff, then the conversation would turn into this. Well, those people who committed those 5 Baptist sins, they thought they were having fun and they thought they were happy, but really they were not. They weren't happy at all. And those of us who've abstained from all of that kind of activity, we're really the joyous and happy ones. I remember when I was really starting to get caught up in these conversations in my early 20s, that I was a college student, and I was watching those and listening to the stories of those who were drinking and smoking, cussing, having sex before marriage, and watching R-rated movies. They did indeed seem to be having more fun than I was. But I was going to stay true to my call. I was trying to earn all the righteous credits that I could earn. So what happened early in my Pharisee years is that I wasn't really socializing or doing anything. In fact, most weekends, I was at home alone, while other young people were out going to clubs and having fun and gathering and doing stuff together. I remember that at one point, my father, who was by no means a righteous person, but he is the one who brought me up in this tradition, was concerned. And so I don't know what led him to ask, but he finally said, "Why are you home every weekend and not enjoying your life as a young person? Why aren't you going and hanging out with your friends?" So I, in my best Pharisaical stance and in all my piety and all of my righteousness, let him know that, "Father, since I am going into ministry, I cannot allow myself to hang out with people who do those kinds of things and go to those kinds of places." "Oh," he said. And his response to my Pharisaical piety was this: "Well, what's going to happen is you're going to perfect yourself in total isolation." Once again, not the answer I was expecting to hear. And you know what? He was right. However, fortunate for me, eventually throughout life, I learned how to liberate myself from the Pharisaical experience and started learning how to live life and living it fully. If these beliefs are the ones that dominate your faith, that only those who are earning all the righteous credits are going to be able to go to heaven, and that somehow you're feeling cheated, that those who haven't earned all of those credits and those religious merit badges, they get to go to heaven too, then this parable is going to be very distressing for you. Now, 40 years later, I see this parable as something very different than what I did back in my college days and my seminary days. And what I've learned to know is this: heaven and hell is a reality that we create in time and space. When Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like, he's not talking about an eternal destination for those who've racked up a lot of the righteous credits. He's talking about a place that resides in the soul of every human being. The kingdom of heaven is not out there, but the kingdom of heaven is right here in our heart and our soul. So, we have the capacity to make the world around us a heavenly experience or a hellacious one. And it seems to me that if I make my life and those around me to live in a holy hell because of my efforts for heavenly perfection, then no one is being helped at all. Nobody's winning anything, right? So how in the world do we take a look at this? What I see in this parable is something that's much more substantive than what I experienced in my early years. It seems to me what it's really saying is that the goal in life is to evolve in our consciousness, evolve in our capacity to fulfill what God created us to fill. Because each and every one of us, whether we have the same religion or not, are created in that image, the image of the divine. And that's the goal. And what it seems to me is that some of us experience that at different stages of life. Some people know when they're a child what they want to be and what they want to do, and their whole life is spent preparing themselves for that task, and they perform that task their whole life. They have ups and downs like all the rest of us, but they knew from the time that they were a child who they needed to be and wanted to be, and they've lived their whole life being that. And they also knew up front what the cost would be and what the rewards might be. Many years ago, I read Bob Dylan's autobiography, and I believe that he was one of those persons who knew from a very young age who he was, what he wanted to do, how he was going to do it, where he was going to do it, and then he spent his life doing it, right? Now, he was born as Robert Allen Zimmerman in Duluth, Minnesota. And later in life, his family moved to a very small town of Hibbing, Minnesota. And in the book, Bob Dylan shares this. He says, I knew that I was going to do something big in my life. And I knew just as clearly that what I was going to achieve in life was not going to happen in Hibbing, Minnesota. So at age 19, he dropped out of college, $40 in his pocket, took a bus to New York, and when he arrived in New York, well, then the rest is history. But that, to me, would illustrate someone who, at 6 a.m., was encountered by the owner of the vineyard, who I believe would be God in the parable, and the owner of the vineyard invited him to come and to work and to do what he was, knowing that what his reward was going to be. Right? He knew up front what the costs and the rewards were going to be. But others of us, it takes more time for us to figure out, who am I and what am I supposed to be doing? I would look at those persons as those who were hired around noontime in the parable. Those of us who find out later in life, or at least start asking the question, who am I? What am I doing, and what is my purpose? We often call that stage in the period of life as the midlife crisis. And as I was preparing and studying to become a counselor, and then overall the years that I have done counseling, I learned that typically that stage in life happens between age 35 and 45. How is that? Well, you think about it. While you're growing up in your home, your family's all defining who you are and what you're supposed to be doing, and finally you graduate, and then you go to college or trade school, and then you're working so hard to be able to prepare yourself for your career, and then in your 20s, you're doing everything that you can to establish that career. Also, typically in your 20s and early 30s, you get married, then you have children, you have your home, you have your mortgage, and somewhere between the ages of 35 and 45, all that preparation and all that work you've done to fulfill these goals is completed. And now what? And people stop and ask the question, who am I? What in the world am I doing? And what purpose am I supposed to be serving? And it's interesting how different people respond to those questions. Some people in the midlife crisis will respond by, anecdotally, the buying the red sports car and having an affair and then losing their family and starting all over again. But what I've discovered personally, and with many others that I've worked with over the years, that when people start asking those questions, they're serious. And they genuinely want to discover the answers to those questions. So they start that process of recreating themselves in some cases. When I was in seminary, in my early 20s, the average age of the students there was 36. So most of the students in seminary were people who were now starting their second career. They had been doing something else, and at age 36 to 45, they felt that they had a call to ministry, and they shut everything down, and they went to study for this new call and prepare themselves for this new line of work in the world, right? So that, for me, would be those people who were hired around noon. The ultimate goal, I believe, is this. Our ultimate goal in this life on this earth is to evolve and grow into the person we were meant to be, regardless of how much time it takes. Some of us learn it early, some of us learn it in the middle, and some of us learn it late. But it doesn't matter when you start to learn it. It doesn't matter when you start getting the questions. Time is not the issue. What it matters is that you're doing it, that you are making those discoveries. And not only are you making the discoveries, but you're creating the changes in your life so that you can be the person that God created you to be. One of my flights from Orlando to Las Vegas, Nevada, to visit Amy, I watched a movie on the plane called Western Star by Bruce Springsteen, and it really, really touched me deeply. I was completely enthralled with it. And I remember, Bruce Springsteen when I was in junior high school and listening to the radio very loudly in the afternoon, much to my mother's chagrin. Baby, we were born to run, right? And you think of Bruce Springsteen, he's been a rock star, he's toured the world, he writes music, he's a multi-gazillionaire, he's done it all, right? Success in every realm of the music industry that you can think of. And yet, in Western Star, he reveals the true struggles that he has had in his life in discovering who I am. And he, like me, started making those discoveries much later in life. He puts himself in that equation with narration that digs into his struggles with depression, building a family, learning how to let go of his solitary male rage. That was his words, solitary male rage. And as he looked back on his life, he wondered, what was I so angry about? And he looked back and he said, why was it that I was conscious of and intentional about driving away those persons that I loved and who loved me the most? And in the documentary or in the movie that he made, he said, what was all the arguing about? What purpose did it serve? What did I gain from all the fighting and the arguing that I did with people? And it was later in life when he wasn't touring as much and he had that huge farm in California and he's able to slow down that he started asking these questions and then he started finding his answers. And he was able to make incredible change of his life because his music career was a part of who he was, but it did not define who he was as a human being. And now he is a man who writes incredible music, who can tell incredible stories, but he's doing it from a place of much greater peace. And one of the reasons why I connected so deeply with that movie was this, is that Bruce Springsteen and I have traveled very different paths in life. My life experience is nothing like his, and his life experience has very little to do with mine. But what I found interesting is that at around the same stage of life, we've both started to discover the same truths. Regardless of how we got there, we're discovering the same truths. I knew when I was 19, 20 years old, I felt a call to ministry. I really didn't know what that meant. I really didn't know what the options were, quite frankly. I always thought, well, if you're called to ministry, it means you're going to be a pastor of a church, and that's what I prepared myself for. But I've never felt comfortable in that role because I've never felt that I fell into the stereotypical definition and idea of what a pastor is. And somehow I had to make it work. But later in life, in 2007, I was 50 years old, and I was starting to put it together. I was starting to find the answers to the questions of who am I? What is my purpose? And how am I supposed to serve myself, my family, and the world around me? And since 2007, the last 13 years have been the most successful for me, personally and professionally, because I had clarity about who am I, what is it I am supposed to be doing, and how am I going about fulfilling that purpose. In 1995, I became the pastor of the Windermere Union Church, July of 1995. I was just turned 38 years old. And when I accepted the call to Windermere Union Church from the Center for Drug-Free Living, I had no idea that I would be here 25 years later and what would transpire in those 25 years. And as I reflect back on the time that I have spent here, the great gift to my life has been Windermere Union Church has given me the freedom over all of these years to discover who I am and what my purpose in life is and how am I supposed to be going about serving that purpose. The Windermere Union Church has been with me during my failures. They have celebrated with me during my successes, and most importantly, they've been supportive in all the years in between those extremes. And the church has always allowed me to explore and to create and to experiment. I remember one period during my personal growth, I was really into quantum physics and reading books about it and Albert Einstein, and I don't know how many weeks of sermons I preached about quantum physics and its relationship with spiritual development, but the church sat and listened to all those sermons and never once told me, yeah, we think you need to get off that and get back to some of the good old, the church has always allowed me to be who I am. And you know what? It's not unique to me. This church has done that for everybody who's ever walked through the doors and who've become a part of this faith community. And I believe, all right, I'm qualifying what I'm about to say, I believe that is the purpose of the church, to create a safe environment where people can ask questions, where people can explore, and give them the space to become their truest self and find how they can express that self and serve themselves and the world around them. It seems to me that the great questions that we need to be asking are these. Are you living? Are you loving? And are you serving to your fullest potential? Are you living? Are you becoming and being the person that you've always dreamt of being and becoming? Are you clear about what that is? And are you willing to do whatever it takes to fulfill that desire to be the best human being that you can be? Are you loving? Like I said earlier, it does nobody any good for me to create a holy hell for all those around me while I'm trying to somehow fulfill my heavenly righteousness and obeying all the religious rules, right? Are you loving? Have you learned how to love yourself? Do you have the capacity to love others as you love yourself? Do we have the capacity collectively to love one another as Jesus has loved us? And are you serving? As we grow into this person that God created us to be, we get rid of all the baggage and the toxic belief systems and all the things that hold us back. Are we being that person that we've known somewhere deep within us our whole life? Have we finally taken the risk to become that person who is learning how to live, learning how to love, and learning how to serve? And once again, the parable shows us that it's not how long you've worked in the vineyard of life, but the important thing is that you showed up and you started the process. And it's different paths for all of us. It's all, in the years that I worked with people who were overcome by addiction to drugs, alcohol, or whatever, all the other myriad of things we can be addicted to. It was in that addiction that they lost a sense of themselves. They lost a sense of their spirituality. They lost their relationships. They gave up everything, their career. They would give up everything. Their freedom, many of them would end up being institutionalized or going to jail. They gave up everything for their addiction, but it was in the point of recovery. They discovered who they were and then were courageous enough to start living that life even though it felt like all the odds were against them. God, I admire anybody who has recovered from drug and alcohol addiction and made an incredible life for themselves. And for many of us, it's also just looking at toxic belief systems that we have and toxic behaviors that we engage in, and who do we invite to be involved in our lives, and who are we willing to let go because they hold us back. It doesn't matter the path. The paths are going to be as different as all of us. What is important is what? That when the vineyard owner comes to us and say, you want to work in my vineyard, we say what? Yes. And we agree to the wages, and we agree to the rewards. And we're willing to make whatever sacrifices are necessary to become that full person that God created us to be. Regardless if we start the process of consciousness and enlightenment in the morning and noon or late afternoon, the important thing is this: are we doing the work to receive the reward of becoming fully who God created us to be? Thus ends the lessons. Go with peace and purpose. God bless you all. Amen.